Hey guys, and welcome to another round of U.S. History with Lennox. And today we're looking at Antebellum Reform, a time period in American history when society starts to make changes that hopefully will be for the betterment of the entire society. Now, when we talk about this time period, we're talking about the period during the Jacksonian era, generally considered between 1824 and 1844, that 20-year period. That's when reform really got its start in America. But there's a lot of other things going on, and that's what you have to remember about American history. It's not just a single timeline. It's generally several parallel timelines, different things happening at the same time. So when we talk about the reform movement of the 19th century, you also have to remember that what's going on in America is we're seeing a rise in industry following the American War with Great Britain, the War of 1812. So we're going to see industry rise in our country. You're also going to see the increase of slavery in our country, thanks in part to the invention of the cotton gin and the rise of King Cotton as our economic foundation. Women's roles are going to be changing during this time. So all of this is going on at the exact same time, and the reform movement is just one part of American history, but it's a very important part. And so that's what I want to talk about today. Now, when we say the term antebellum, antebellum typically means the time period before the war. And when we're looking at American history, you could make the argument that it means the period before every war we fought in, but typically and generally almost all the time when they talk about the antebellum time period, they're talking about prior to the Civil War. So when we look at different time periods in American history, the antebellum period falls in this time period from 1820 to 1860. If you want like an exact event that maybe started this off, I would take the Missouri Compromise of 1820. And then it ends with the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860. So those are your two bookends for this time period. There's a lot of new ideas in religion that come out during this time period, during this second reform movement, and a lot of these ideas spur this reform movement. The idea of deism, we got introduced to that during the Enlightenment period, but it's that reliance on reason, where you see people relying more on science, less on biblical knowledge. Now, this wasn't a rejection of God. People still believed in God, but they believed that humans had the capacity for moral behavior without God, if you will. You also have the rise of Unitarianism during this time. This was a less extreme version of what we considered Puritanism. Now, Puritanism, if you remember correctly, was about predestination and earning your way into heaven with good works. Well, what Unitarianism is that humans actually have free will. There is no predestination. There is no inherent desire to be wicked or to sin, but humans have this free will and they can earn their salvation if they choose to with good works on earth, but they have that choice. So these are two new ideas that are going to spur up during this time. But make no mistake, we're still dealing with a Christian-based society. We can go back to the First Great Awakening, which we'll compare this time period to. And in the First Great Awakening, it was about emotionalism, fire and brimstone's preaching, and we look at a time period right around the 1730s, 1740s. Now, what the First Great Awakening and people like Jonathan Edwards taught us was that human sinfulness, the evil in humans, is just something we're born in. It's just inherent. Now, this is going to change a little bit when we get to the Second Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening about 100 years later, and it's going to be another religious revival in our country. It's going to be spurred on by people that we call itinerant preachers, preachers that would travel throughout the country, making guest appearances at churches or having camp meetings and stuff like that. That's similar to the First Great Awakening. One of the leaders is going to be Charles Finney, who was a revivalist. Now, he's going to start this revival in New York, and the area he starts in is often referred to as the burned over district. He is going to preach against things such as slavery and alcohol, and so this will tie directly to some of the reform movements that are going to spring up during this time. The Second Great Awakening, though, is different than the First Great Awakening. The First Great Awakening taught the idea of predestination and Calvinism. The Second Great Awakening is going to introduce a new theory of Arminianism, that we do indeed have free will. that we can choose salvation or we can choose damnation, but it's our choice. And if we choose to follow Jesus and accept the salvation that comes through him, that's where we get the term born again Christians. Now, the revivalists during this time period are going to focus on the conversion of believers, and they look to change the heart of people, not change their behavior, but first change their heart, because if you do that, behavior will naturally follow. What we see also during the Second Great Awakening, very similar to the First Great Awakening, is the growth of denominations. We're going to see more attendance in churches, and we're going to see a lot more attendance in these different denominations. Methodists and Baptists are primarily going to be the number 1 and 2 religions that grow out of the Second Great Awakening. When we compare these two, there's some slight differences. The First and Second Great Awakening, both religious revivals, they share that in common. They both used emotional, fire and brimstone preaching. But the differences lay in their influence. Calvinism is going to influence the First Great Awakening, where Arminianism will influence the Second Great Awakening. Both seeking conversion of non-believers, both saw the spread of non-traditional denominations, both promoted democratic ideas. I think this is important when you look at it from an American viewpoint, that they lined up with this idea of democracy and people and individuals having a voice. And just what they influenced, the First Great Awakening had an influence on the American Revolution. The Second Great Awakening is going to have an influence on Antebellum Reform. So there's the big differences between the two. And like I said, the effect in the Second Great Awakening is going to be it inspires reform in the country. When you look at it, it's about the individual. And the idea was that individuals can make a difference. It's not about the government stepping in, it's about the people stepping in. And that's that democratic ideal. Some of the reform movements that are going to grow out of the Second Great Awakening include abolitionism, temperance, the prison reform, and of course the women's movement. The key part of the Second Great Awakening, I think, that has the biggest effect was the role that women had in religion. They had a much stronger voice in the church during the Second Great Awakening, and they made up the majority of the new church members during that time. They are going to be tasked with bringing the family back to God, and they are going to be inspired to not only be involved in the church, but to be involved in other reform movements in our country. With regards to the abolition movement, we've already seen a little movement towards that when we had the introduction of the American Colonization Society in 1816. Their premise was that we had these freedmen in our country due to the gradual emancipation that was taking place in the North, and they were going to give those freedmen the opportunity to leave America and go help colonize a new area in Africa. The idea behind this, quite honestly, was that many of the founders of the American Colonization Society could not see a society where both black and white could live together. And so this was their solution. But it wasn't about abolition. It was about dealing with the freedmen who already lived here. Abolitionism was about bringing slavery to an end, not just in northern states, but in the entire country. William Lloyd Garrison is probably one of the leading members of the abolition movement in the 1830s. He created the American Anti-Slavery Society, and he said that colonization is not the answer. He said the problem doesn't lie with where we live. The problem lies in how we're living, and we are living in a country with slavery, and that's wrong. He's going to start publishing an anti-slavery newspaper called The Liberator, and it was based out of Boston, Massachusetts. He'll publish this newspaper for almost 34 years. But one thing you have to remember is that while we look back at abolitionism as this critical movement during the Reform period of the United States, it was seen as a very radical idea in the early years. Remember, we started with the American Colonization Society, which wasn't about ending slavery. It was more about creating a specific society. Abolitionism was about ending slavery, and that was seen as, like I said, radical during this time. And there were a lot of negative reactions. In fact, there were anti-abolitionist riots in our country, especially in the North. In New York City, there was a couple of them. There was one in Boston. There was a couple in Cincinnati. And like I said, it was a radical idea. Now, other than the abolitionist movement, there was also the temperance movement. And the temperance movement was a movement against alcohol in our society. The American Temperance Society was founded in 1826, and what they did was they promoted a dry message, meaning we need to rid society of alcohol, become dry. They said that alcohol was this threat to family life. A lot of people were moving to the cities at this point, and industrial jobs were very prevalent during this time, and it wasn't uncommon for men after a day's work to go out and have a drink. And that was seen as a threat to the family life because they weren't going home to spend time with their families. Now, there were certain groups that alcohol was typically associated with, and in this time period, it's going to be the immigrants, specifically the Irish and the Germans. Now, America is going to start to move from this idea of temperance to legal prohibition. We'll see the temperance movement go throughout the 1800s, but when we get into the 1900s, it's going to change. It's going to be like people aren't going to give up drinking on their own, so let's just make them do it with laws. And that's when we get to the Prohibition movement, which will eventually lead to the 18th Amendment in the 1920s when alcohol is illegal in the United States. This is the Drunkard's Progress here. This is a cartoon that came out that showed the danger of alcohol. And the idea behind this cartoon was that it would present this progress or this path that men would eventually walk down should they start drinking. It might just start with a drink after work, but then it would turn into a couple drinks after work, hanging out with your buddies and maybe a little gambling. And then after a while, it would be reliance on that drink after work until you were drinking so much you would lose your job, lose your money, lose your house, and you would be destitute. And then outside of that, that could lead to a life of crime because you had to find money to get more alcohol. And when that didn't work, look at the last step. It's brutal. It said that first glass of wine with a friend on the far left, if you stay on that path, will end in suicide on the far right. And look who's left behind mourning all of this. Your family, your wife, your children. And that's why the Temperance Society said we need to rid this country of alcohol and stop drinking. The temperance movement did have some success. In 1851, the Maine law was passed, which made alcohol illegal in the state of Maine. Another law was the 15-Gallon Act in Massachusetts, passed in 1838. Now, this law was set up to basically shut down bars because it said if you're going to buy alcohol, you have to buy 15 gallons, no less. Well, that was really expensive, and most people don't walk into a bar and say, I want to buy 15 gallons of alcohol. But what was interesting was how people got around this. Some people would go into a bar, they'd want to buy a gallon of alcohol, or they'd go into a store to buy a gallon of alcohol, and the store would have a 16-gallon casket of alcohol. And what they would do is they would sell 16 gallons to the customer, but then the customer would then turn around and sell 15 gallons back, being able to buy that single gallon of alcohol. I think one of my favorite ones, though, is the striped pig races. What bars would do is they would advertise a striped pig race. And what they would do is take a common pig and paint stripes on it. And you would pay to see the pig. Well, then once you saw the pig, you were rewarded with free alcohol. So go to the race, get free alcohol. And that's how they started to get around this law. It only lasted for about 2 years before it was repealed. But hey, at least they tried. Another reform movement during this time period is going to be public education. There was this value in public education that people were starting to see. Number one, they could use education to instill Republican values. Not only Republican values, but values of discipline and hard work. And then also, public education could be used to educate and Americanize all these new immigrants that are starting to come into our country. The father of public education reform is going to be Horace Mann. He was the secretary of the Massachusetts Board of Education. And he is going to push the value of a free public elementary education. He pushed for the idea of longer terms of education, like not just 3 months out of the year, but maybe 9 months out of the year, and compulsory attendance, meaning that children of a certain age had to go to school by law. They expanded the curriculum beyond just reading and writing, and then they started to build more and more schools. Now, public education was this great idea and a great movement, but within the southern states, it's still going to be very rare until after the Civil War, because there's still a rule against teaching slaves to read, and most people who are going to be educated in the South are going to be the children of the wealthy, and they have always been educated by private tutors. One example of education during this time period can be seen in a reader that was provided to elementary students. And what's kind of cool about this is you see a crossover between different movements, in this case, education and temperance. Notice the reading. Drunkenness is a vice which is remarkably ensnaring and deceitful. The frequent witnessing of any sin has a direct tendency to weaken our impression of its criminality. So what they're doing is they're using the view of poor social behavior as the subject matter that the kids are learning to read. So it's kind of like you're killing two birds with one stone. You're teaching children to read, but you're also teaching them how to be viable citizens within society. Another reform during this time is going to be prison and asylum reform, led by Dorothea Dix. Dorothea Dix is going to see the absolute failure we have had in how we treated those who had mental or physical conditions and how we treated those in prison. And she said there is room for reform within these two areas. And she's going to start working with those people to make life better, not only for people who live in asylums, but also create a better life for people in prison. Hopefully, once they get out, they'll become more productive members of society. And finally, I want to talk about the women's movement. Thanks in part to the Second Great Awakening, women see they have a more vital role in society. And so they saw what was happening within our society politically, and they said, hey, something's not right. We see this rise of democracy with Jackson and the common man principle of voting, and they realized that the women were still second-class citizens. On top of that, you had what was referred to as the cult of domesticity, this idea that the home was the women's sphere of influence, which it was, but they didn't want to limit it to the home. And don't forget Republican motherhood, where women were expected to raise good citizens. So all of that kind of comes together within this women's reform movement, and women are going to start demanding rights. They're going to get involved in a lot of the movements. It's not just the women's rights movement, but they're also going to get involved in the temperance movement and the abolition of slavery. Some of the most influential women include Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who advocated for women's suffrage. This is the first time women start talking about the right to vote. It's going to take some time, but someone had to start it, and Mott and Stanton are the ladies who did that. One date you got to know, 1848, the Seneca Falls Convention. Write this one down. This was a women's rights convention in New York in 1848 where they drafted the Declaration of Sentiments. This was the first document that advocated for women's suffrage, the very first time women mentioned that they wanted the right to vote. And they modeled the Declaration of Sentiments to the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. This is going to launch the modern women's rights movement. But unfortunately, in the time, it got overshadowed by other movements, specifically the abolition movement. If you want to pick one movement that comes out of the Reform era that really gained steam and got something accomplished, it's going to be the abolition movement. Had a very rough start, was seen as really radical, but as time goes on, more and more people are going to come on board. And so coming out of the, quote, reform movement, the abolitionists have the most success. Also going on during this time is a period of what we call Transcendentalism, and this actually contributes to the reform movement. Now, I'm not going to go too far in depth to it. What you need to know is this was a uniquely American philosophy. We've talked about the Enlightenment before. That was another philosophy that came out, but it originated in Europe. Transcendentalism originated here in America, and the idea was that truth transcends the senses, and we need to look within ourselves for truth. And the Transcendentalists believe that our greatness is in the individual, not the group. That kind of lined up with social reform because social reform was about individuals getting involved to improve society. The founder of Transcendentalism is going to be Ralph Waldo Emerson, but I'm going to focus more on his student, Henry David Thoreau. Now, Emerson is going to teach primarily this idea of self-reliance and self-improvement. He believed in freedom. Now, he is going to draft the American Scholar, which is going to challenge Americans to create their own art and their own culture. And that's what's going to happen. I think with the Reform movement and with Transcendentalism, we see the rise of this American culture. And one of the examples of this culture is going to be the Hudson River School. Now, this is a response directly to Ralph Waldo Emerson's challenge. And what the Hudson River School was a group of artists who went out to capture the undiluted power of nature. They wanted to capture the Western frontier. And a lot of these pictures on the last couple slides that I've had actually are paintings from the Hudson River School. They believe within these pictures, if you notice, and if you search them online, there are humans in the pictures, but they're very insignificant. The focus is on nature, and that's what they wanted to capture, that raw nature that was part of America. Their paintings reflected, different effects of light on water, and a lot of the different themes they painted about were what was going on in society at the time. Transcendentalism, westward expansion, nationalism, and the price of progress. Now, Henry David Thoreau, Emerson's student, is going to take this idea of the individual responsibility in society a step further. And he believed that one of the responsibilities we have is to rebel against a government that's not doing its job. Thoreau wrote the book Civil Disobedience, and in that book, he said that there are times when open rebellion is justified in our society. He said we can do that when injustice is no longer occasional, but a major characteristic. He also said when the government demands that people cooperate with injustice. And I want you to think about that as you look back on all the movements of the Reform era. When you think about abolitionism, when you think about temperance, when you think about education, Thoreau would tell you that people in society needed to rebel against some of the actions of society, specifically abolition, because it was wrong. And just because government supported it doesn't make it right. And that's where he said we need to step up with what was called civil disobedience. He didn't believe in taking up arms against the government, but he also believed that you shouldn't follow a law that's not just. But if you are not going to follow that law, if you make that decision not to follow it, then you must be willing to take on the responsibility of the punishment. A perfect example of someone who followed Henry David Thoreau's teaching about civil disobedience and standing up to laws that are wrong would be Martin Luther King Jr. during the civil rights era of the 1950s and 60s. Thoreau famously said that if government requires you to be the agent of injustice to another, then I say break the law. That's the same way that Martin Luther King Jr. lived. Gandhi is another great example. So this idea of civil disobedience is going to be formed during this time period, and it is uniquely an American idea, part of this American Transcendentalist movement. So there you have it, a brief look at American Reform and the Transcendentalist movement. Remember, these two movements, while operating independently of one another, basically fed into each other. Transcendentalism says it's about the individual, and the social reform movement said it's about individuals stepping forward to make society better. Hope you learned a little something today. I know it was real quick, but you can always go back and watch it again. But otherwise, we'll see you on the next time around. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.